Hi, this is Mary from the Daily Sew. I just made these great pajamas with this cool fabric from my friend at Poem Crown and the assembly lines free pajama pattern. First, I wanted to let you know about the pattern because it is a good pattern and it is free. And then I wanted to show you how to sew it as the pattern has shorts with an elastic waist. But I also wanted to show you how to make it as pants if you prefer pants, and how to switch out the elastic for a drawstring if that's your preference. So it's a fairly quick and easy project. It won't take you much time and I'm going to guide you through it. If you're ready, let's go. Alright, first you're going to need some fabric. And I chose my friend Lisa's Wandering Vine design from Spoonflower. I'll put the link below. And you want it washed, dried, and ready to go. Now how much fabric you need will depend on if your fabric is directional, meaning it has a direction, or not, and of course how wide it is. These are some approximations. You're also going to need the Assembly Lines free pattern, and you can get that at theassemblylineshop.com. I'll put the link below. You do print it off, and because you print it off and it comes in all of these tiles, you're going to need some tape to tape it. You're also going to need some tracing paper in order to trace off the size that you want. And then you will need some elastic. For an elastic waist, it calls for 30 millimeter. 1 inch is close and easily available here in the United States. Or if you're doing drawstring, you'll need twill tape or cord or ribbon. You're going to need some fusible interfacing. This Pelon SF101 is again easily available and it works pretty well, but you just need a little, so you might have some scraps lying around, which are great. Your usual suspects of thread, pins, scissors, and this pattern calls for an overlock stitch on your seam, so a serger or an overlock machine, but you can get the same effect with a sewing machine and a zigzag stitch. Let's talk a little bit about the pattern. It is in metric, and if you use inches like I do, you'll have to Google the conversion for inches to centimeters, centimeters to inches to figure out the size. When you go to print off the pattern, you can see on the left side menu there is layers, and you can turn on and off the different layers to print only the sizes you want to print. You can print them all off and then trace off the size you want. The fabric required is for both the top and the bottom. We are just doing the bottom in this video, and those were the fabric requirements I gave you. So you've got your pattern printed, and you see it has a map of all the different pieces of paper and how they tape together. You follow that along, and you don't have to make one big sheet. You can just tape together the bottom back, the bottom front, the top back, and then it's a little more easy to tape together. It doesn't get off crooked too easily. What I always do is I cut off the top and one side of every piece of paper, and I usually stack them up and do it. And then that makes it easier to line up. So you cut off, say, the top and the left side of every paper piece, which is actually a pattern. And then you line it up depending on the manufacturer. This one has nice little triangles, lines up very easily. And you just do that until you get the entire pattern piece taped together. All right, I wanted to show you something on the shorts pattern. You see these hem notches on the outer leg? They're not on the inner leg seam for all the sizes. So what I did is I went ahead and I measured the distance between the notches on the outer leg seam, and then I just drew them in at that distance on the inner leg seam. Okay, let's go ahead and trace it off. I always find it's nice to weigh down the tracing paper and or the pattern, just because if not, something gets knocked and then your whole thing's off and you gotta start over again. That's not fun. Rulers, curved and straight, can be very handy when tracing off patterns, but I find a very easy, quick way is just doing dashed lines. It's really quick for me to draw them in, and if they're close enough together, I can see exactly the line I need to follow when I cut out the pattern. So you might want to try that. Also, don't forget to put in your notches, all of them. There are a lot of notches, pocket placement, hem, waist, casing, lots of notches on this pattern. Make sure you get them all. It's a lot easier to sew if you have your notches. If you want to, you can do a straight hem instead of that curve. The curve isn't a little nice, but the straight hem is of course easier to sew. It's quicker. You don't have to ease anything in. So that's an option if you want it. Okay, let's talk about making pants. Go ahead and get that inseam, and you're going to measure what your inseam, what you want the length to be from the inseam. Mine, I wanted it to be 27 inches long from the crotch down to the hem. So I'm going to measure down from the inseam 27 inches. And then I'm going to draw a line straight across at the bottom. And I want that line to be perpendicular to the grain line on the pattern. And that's basically where I'm going to end my legs. So then I'm just going to draw my legs down, just continuing them on down to that line where I want it to end. And this I did by eyeball. It is pajama pants, so I felt safe in doing that. And do remember that if I draw straight down, I'm going to have a pretty wide flared pant leg. So I just kept going in and tapering it a little here and there. If you remember looking at a pants pattern before, you'll see that the legs kind of come in. Just make sure you cross off the lines that you don't want. Remember what lines you want, what lines you don't want. Of course, we have to add our hem allowance. What I marked first for that bottom line was just where I want the pants to end. So I also need some fabric to fold up and hem. Get the right shape of the hem, fold the pattern up, and trace off the pant leg. And that'll give you the correct shape at the hem there. The second pants pattern, line one on top of the other and trace off the same shape of the leg. Line up at the inseam and then shift your patterns to line up at the front outer seam as well and trace that off. Now it's time for cutting out. Pay attention to the direction of your fabric. This one has no direction, even though it looks like it might. It doesn't. It's the same upside down, right side up. And you're going to need 2 of each of the shorts pattern, and you're going to need 4 of the pocket patterns. Because you need 2, I've folded my fabric in half, and that way I only have to cut out each piece once, except for that pocket. I'm going to have to cut that out once and then put it somewhere else and cut it out again. If you don't have enough fabric to get the pocket pieces, you can always make them out of some other fabric. They are inside the pant. Just remember to cut your notches. Again, snip them all. They'll make a big difference. And when you see the edge of the fabric or the fold of the fabric, you want that to be parallel to the grain line on your pattern. That is how you get it on grain. Just kind of flip it up, and you can use a ruler. I just eyeball it, unless it's really special fabric, and then I will definitely measure my grain line to make sure it's parallel to the edge or the fold of the fabric. Go ahead and cut out your pieces. Okay, remember I said this pattern says you want to overlock all your edges. If you have a serger or an overlock machine, great, you can do that. If you don't, you can use a zigzag stitch. You basically want the stitch to encase that raw edge. So there are other stitches on your machine probably. You want to just sew it first with the normal stitch and then some kind of stitch to encase that raw edge. All right, so I have my front piece here, and if your fabric is very lightweight, you're gonna wanna put interfacing on both the front and the back. This is why I have scraps, because you just need a tiny bit. It's about 3/4 inches wide by 7 inches long, just a little bit longer than the notches on the pocket for the pocket placement. So cut 2 strips. Again, you want 4 if your fabric is very lightweight. You'll do it on each piece where the pocket notches are, pocket placement notches. Now the strip is a tiny bit bigger than the pocket placement notches, tiny bit longer, so you overhang it on both ends, the top end and the bottom end, about 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. So now we're going to fold at the waist notches. It is about 1.5 inches if you are doing inches. The pattern tells you the centimeters. I don't remember right offhand. And I fold each in because it is curved, and then I have to kind of pull it into place. And you can double check with the ruler as you go. And there's a lot of just finagling and pulling, and you'll get it. Again, I iron the ends first, and then I kind of pull it, and it tends to go in place. It tends to just kind of fall in place. It's always good to double check with a ruler though. And you're gonna do the same on both of the waist, and then again at the hem, there's the hem notches. When you get all that ironed up, you're gonna line up both backs. Remember, double notch means back. Single notch means the front. You're going to line up both backs and you're going to line up both fronts, and you're going to sew them on that center seam. Remember to unfold that waist casing, and you're just going to sew down the center and overlock your raw edges, or zigzag, whatever one you have. Just remember to unfold that waist casing. And then when you're done, you're going to press the seam allowances to one side or the other according to the pattern. And then time to put the pockets on. Now remember, the pockets themselves do not have notches, but the side seams all have notches for where the pockets go. So find your notches, and if you have interfacing there, you just have to look a little harder. But here's mine because this is the back piece and I don't have interfacing. And the pocket's a little bit bigger, but I know my seam allowance is 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter, and I'm going to overhang the pocket that amount on each end. You can put the pin anywhere you want at the top, but at the bottom, you want to know where that notch is. That bottom notch is very important. That is where you're going to stop sewing. So you want to be able to see where that notch is. You could use a pen. You mark it with a pencil. It will come out in the wash, most cases, or some other kind of fabric marker. I find a pen easy to see as I'm approaching it. The presser foot doesn't get in the way of seeing the pen. And then you are going to take it to the machine and sew it down from top to bottom notch with a slightly less seam allowance than 1 centimeter. So just slightly go in. This one I've sewn and I've stopped there at the notch, and I've overcast the edge with a zigzag stitch because it's easier to stop than a overlock machine. And now it's time to understitch it. Understitching is when you take the seam allowance and you're just going to sew it to the pocket in this case. So both seam allowances, the short seam allowance and the pocket seam allowance, is going to be sewn strictly to the pocket. And you're going to stop again at that notch. So what the understitching does is it keeps the pocket inside the pants. It keeps it from creeping out. And I've done it on this one pocket here, and you can see it in the darker stitches. And again, you can see the understitching stopped at that bottom notch as well. So now you're going to go and do that to all 4 pockets. You're going to stitch down, then overlock the edge or zigzag the edge, stopping again at the notch, and then you're going to understitch. After that, you'll give it a good pressing. Again, remember, stop everything at that bottom notch. When all 4 pockets are attached, both to the front and the back, you are going to have the front and the back lined up on the side seams, facing each other always. Again, unfold the waist casing and unfold the hem allowance. You're going to line them up and pin them in place because you're going to sew them together. Now up here at the waist casing, you're going to see that they don't quite, one goes in, one goes out. You just kind of, you'll make it work. Get them together, sew them together. You just have to manipulate it a little bit with your fingers. All right, when you've got them all pinned up, you're going to sew down to the top notch, which is, remember, is about your seam allowance. Then you're going to sew around the pocket, come back up to that bottom notch, which you can nicely identify because of your stitching. All your stitching tends to stop there. And then you're going to sew down to the end. So you go down, pivot, around the pocket, pivot, and down to the hem. And when you get that all done, you're going to zigzag or overlock it. And you're not getting an exact, when you zigzag here, you're not getting exactly into that. That's okay. You're just catching the raw edges. You don't have to worry about that. That's not going to affect. If the bottom at the hem doesn't line up quite, it might be a little off, you can just trim that off. You can just line them up yourself manually after you've sewn them together. Then it calls for bar tacks at the top and the bottom of the pocket. And let me show you what bar tacks are. Bar tacks are simply a narrow and short zigzag stitch, and I definitely suggest making some samples. I went down on mine and then reversed it to make it nice and thick and beefy looking. And then to get them to all be the same length, what I did was I used this pocket seam here that you see as a mark. I would start at the top and then stop sewing when I got down to the seam there. I would go down, up, and then I went down to the bottom of the pocket and did the same thing. Now remember, when you sew this, you're not catching anything but the pocket. You're not catching the back of the shorts. So you stick your machine, you stick it on your machine like that, and then you sew down, move it down, and then sew the other bar tack. While I was at the machine, I went ahead and overstitched the top edge. You are supposed to do it now to the bottom edge of your legs. And this goes true for if you're doing pants or shorts. And next, we're going to sew the inner seam together. Go ahead and line up that center seam, both pieces of the center seam lined up, and then just go ahead and sew it. Then refold up your hem allowance and give it a good pressing. If you are tired of zigzagging, because you have such a wide hem allowance here, you could fold your hem in, fold it in once to get that raw edge inside the hem so it doesn't fray. You could just simply fold it narrow, you could fold it double. But anyway, you do it, then you sew that down. And then you could do the same at the waist casing as well. Instead of zigzagging, you could possibly fold it over like we did with the hem there. The thing with folding over in the casing is you have to watch how wide your elastic is if you're doing elastic, or how wide your drawstring is if you're doing drawstring, because you're taking away from that casing allowance. And so you need to make sure you still have plenty of room for whatever it is you're going to do the waist. But go ahead and sew down your hems, and then let's deviate from the pattern and show you how to do a drawstring waist. Now for the cord and the drawstring, you could use grosgrain ribbon or other ribbon, just you want to make sure it's not too slippery and will hold a tie. You could use twill tape. Twill tape comes in lots of different sizes and actually some different colors. It makes a nice cord. It comes in, again, different widths. You can also use this cotton natural flat cording that is made for drawstrings. Now when you use a drawstring, your width of your drawstring isn't necessarily 1 inch wide, or 30 millimeters wide, as the casing is meant for. So you could sew your casing a little bit more narrow, bring it down from the top or bring it up from the bottom. That's up to you. So to do the drawstring, the first thing we need to do is determine the width of our drawstring, whatever our cording is, because that's going to decide, one, how big to make the entrance and exits for the drawstring. Now for our entrance and exits, we're going to make 2 little buttonholes on the center front. Not through the casing, not through both edges of the casing, but just in the front of the pant. You don't want to sew through the back. You have that seam allowance there that you have to be careful of. You don't want to sew a buttonhole through seam allowance if you don't have to. So go ahead and measure so you get them evenly on both sides of that center seam and down from the top. Mark them and go ahead and sew your buttonholes. Make sure the buttonholes are long enough to accommodate whatever you're using for cording. If you have lightweight fabric, it's always a good idea, even if you don't have lightweight fabric, if you have medium weight fabric, to put a little extra fabric scrap or some interfacing behind where you're going to put the buttonholes, since we're only going to do it on 1 layer of fabric. And that'll just strengthen the buttonholes and also make them, the stitches, prettier. They form better when there's some substantial weight behind them. So there I have made my buttonholes. I've cut them. I basted down my little scrap to keep it in place. I'll take the basting out. And then you're going to sew around the top edge of the casing, whatever the pattern says. So I've got that done, and now let's do the drawstring. I'm going to take the drawstring. I want it to be at least as long as the circumference of the shorts or the pants that I'm making, plus I add about 10 inches. And then I'm going to put the drawstring in first before I sew the casing shut. I'm going to have one end come out. Remember, we're coming from the inside of the pant out, because the drawstring will eventually be inside the casing. So have them come out, the entrance and the exit. And then put it up against the stitching as close as you can and pin it in place. Pinning it in place is also pinning the casing down so that you can sew it shut, but it's also making sure that the drawstring, whatever you're using, isn't going to get in the way of your stitches. You keep keeping it up out of the way of sewing down the casing. Get it all pinned in place, and then you're going to go ahead and stitch the casing down. You can feel where the cord is underneath, so make sure you don't catch the cord. I like to knot the ends of my cord so they don't easily slip back into the casing. And of course, if you have ribbon, you're going to want to use some fray check on the ends. And then you put the fray check on. You can already see my ribbon fraying. I put the fray check on, let it dry, and then I can cut that off. Now the pattern calls for an elastic waistband, and to do that you're going to sew down that top edge first, and then you're going to sew the casing down in place, leaving about 1.5 to 2 inch wide opening in the back. It doesn't really matter. I like to put double pins, 2 pins close together, so that when I'm sewing I can see exactly where to stop. I have that opening, and now it's time to fish the elastic through. Now how much elastic you need is there right on the pattern. Again, it's in centimeters, but you can Google that, how to make it into inches, or a lot of tape measures have centimeters on one side and inches on the other. That's very convenient. If you got that in place, you'll need a safety pin or a bodkin if you have a bodkin, but I have bodkins, I still really like the safety pin method. Works very well. And you're gonna start fishing that through the casing. Kind of have to fight with it, but the main thing you want to not happen is you don't want that end of the elastic to get into the casing somehow. So I always pin it in place. I just pin it down in place, and then I don't have to think about it slipping into the casing. So go ahead and get that elastic all the way around, and then it finally comes out the other end. You will sew your elastic together to make a loop. The pattern calls for a 1 centimeter overlap. You would overlap them and sew them down. Or if you if you're a sensitive person, or if these pants are going to a sensitive person, to reduce the bulk, you can butt up the ends of your elastic and sew them onto a scrap of fabric. You just butt them up and sew them down onto a scrap of fabric. And normally I have 2 layers. I'll fold the fabric over so it's on both layers of the elastic. Once you get your elastic sewn up, it's time to sew up the casing. I like to add a little tag or just scrap of fabric so I can easily see the front from the back when I'm getting changed in the dark, which is common. Elastic waist, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes the back from the front. So when you go to sew that down, the casing down, then you're going to have to sew the elastic down. This is a nice little detail, it keeps the elastic from flipping. You're just finding the seam, the center back seam, center front seam, and the side seams, and you're sewing in the ditch. And I always sew on the right side of the garment so you don't see it. Make sure the elastic is evenly distributed first before you do that. What you're going to do is you're going to line up, and you can see I'm pulling it apart with my fingers. You put the needle right down into the seam and just stitch. Use matching thread in case you miss the seam, but it really doesn't show, it kind of disappears. So now we're all done, but oh yeah, one more step, give your pajamas a good pressing. And don't forget to trim any loose threads. So the assembly line free pajama pattern, and I'll put the link for that pattern in the description below. Well, as you just saw, pajama bottoms are pretty easy to sew, whether you make short version or whether you make the long version. And they're definitely easy to wear. In fact, pajamas aren't just for sleeping in. Well, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below. I'll be sure to reply. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.